All right, welcome everybody. We're going to cover contemporary Black psychology concepts. And one of the first ideas or theories that was postulated by Isabel Wilkerson was the idea that in U.S. we have a caste-based system of oppression based on race. And we're gonna break down what that means, and with a few different examples on the next slide here. So, racism is a caste system in the United States. When I ask in class, in person, do you guys think we have a caste system in the US? And some people say, yes, we do. And I say, what is it based on? And they say the color of your skin. And then some people also say it's based on which class you are in, which socioeconomic status you're in. And I would totally agree. If you really look at the way people are treated, the more money you have, and in the US, the closer to white you are, the better you are treated. And that's just because of the way the country was formed. So we are not the only one who has a caste system. When I went to Mexico, I saw this picture on the right-hand side of the screen here at the Chapultepec Castle, and it is about 12 different images of combinations of skin type and the child that would be produced. And then there's 12 different names on here for the child being darker or lighter skin. So in the top left, you would see, mestizo as the child produced by two folks of Spanish heritage. And then all the way down at the bottom right, we passed mulatto, we passed chino, we've passed lobo, a couple of other terms on here as well. But on the bottom right, you'll see the darkest of the parents and the darkest of the children. And so if you study anything about Mexican history and heritage, you will see that there is a mindset that the lighter you are, the better you are, unfortunately. And that to better the race, it means to marry someone who's lighter skinned, to lighten your children, to better the race. Again, we see this as a system of oppression, and we see it also linked to, I would say, classism as well. Some places will discriminate a bit against religion in their caste. Two of the other examples that are really easy to think of. When we think of caste, we think usually of India as well. India's caste system is a system where there's about 5 different groups of people in a hierarchy, in a pyramid shape. And the people on the bottom are labeled the untouchables, and they are not to be touched at all in society. They are the lowest of the low. They are seen as unhuman in a way, and you are not allowed to go up a class. You're not allowed to marry outside of your class. It is illegal. And there's been a lot of study between the Indian folks who are trying to get rid of the caste system with what Martin Luther King was doing in the U.S. with the civil rights movement. And with Martin Luther King, he did go to India, and they introduced him as an untouchable when he was there, but he could see he was originally taken aback, but then he could see why they labeled him that and welcomed him in respect and everything, and was glad he was there to discuss with their scholars the struggle in America for Black rights. But then he came home and said, clearly, the Black people in America are the lowest of the caste system we have, and we are the untouchables because we were treated as less than human in so many different ways at that time. And last but not least, of course, the other caste system we see very easily is Hitler's caste system in the Nazis, wherein he established himself and everybody in his little group as better than anybody else. Now, it doesn't take long to notice that in Hitler's example, everybody was white. So it wasn't about race necessarily. Race was just what being white wasn't a group that was subcategorized. It wasn't divided. They divided up people by heritage, and they said that if you were, pure, etc., you were at the top, and if you were Jew or anything else, you were towards the bottom, right? And so we know it's not always about race. Some people, it's by religion, it's by heritage, it's by your nationality, sometimes language spoke, etc. There's a lot of different ways people will be able to oppress a caste system. So it's not always about race is my point, and there's a lot of different examples. Like even in India, all those people are pretty much brown, yet we still see discrimination based on the caste system, and the lighter brown folks are at the top and the darker brown folks are at the bottom. So it's important to note that race and racism has its foothold in a lot of different countries across the world in a lot of different ways, but the overall systems of oppression really are hierarchical class systems. And so when we look at our definition of race here, you can see it's synonymous with caste in the US, that it's systems of rules to subordinate and subjugate a group of people, groups of people. Historically, in the US, this has benefited the white race and subjugated all others. It is a social construct, not a biological one. There is no scientific backing for race and racial discrimination. And to place value on physical phenotypes of people always results in some type of oppressive system. And that's what we can see throughout history. And so, like I said, Isabel Wilkerson established that race in the U.S. is based on caste system to oppress and control society. And many other Black scholars have joined her in that understanding of caste and have seen how it is, it can really perpetuate myths about the people at the bottom of any caste system. So that's our myth on race. So further contemporary Black psychological concepts are going to be based on codifying Black experiences, which means understanding Black experiences and giving names to them. So race-based traumatic stress is when we experience emotional and psychological distress from racial discrimination. Scientists have studied this, and they do know that it is real. Physiologically in the body, we do experience changes in cortisol levels, and that changes our stress response, and it heightens our awareness. It increases our vagal nerve stimulation, and it keeps people on edge. It keeps people with their head on a swivel, kind of, and walking on eggshells if you are exposed to race-based traumatic stress. Racial socialization, we've already mentioned a few times. It's just when your parents have to prepare Black children for the challenges of our world that we live in, and somehow trying to establish and keep their social confidence and self-esteem up. Racial battle fatigue is when you're tired of always having to defend yourself, or you're tired of having to talk about race, or you're tired of people turning to you as the only Black person at the meeting and saying, what do Black people think about this thing, so and so? You know, you're just tired of it being something you have to talk about. And so some people do psychologically check out or turn off or are turned away from talking about race. It doesn't make it any better, but I understand why people would do that, because they're tired. They're physiologically, psychologically, and physically tired of talking about race and it being an issue. Racial gaslighting or race lighting is a new term coined to explain the phenomenon of gaslighting from a racial standpoint. Gaslighting is when somebody tells you that something is not happening, even though you know it is. And so you've had an experience, you know this thing is happening, you say, hey, this thing is happening, and they say, no, it's not, you're crazy. Right? And so this is like when someone, like a child, maybe a Black child, goes to their white mother and says, Mom, I was treated this way today in society somewhere. And the mom says, no, that's not really what happened. That just because the person was tired. They don't really mean to treat you that way, you know. And, you know, the child could get very frustrated. That happens a lot in a lot of different situations. That's just one example of racial gaslighting. Internalized racism is when you adopt the negative stereotypes about your own race, because, like I said, we are all sponges and we absorb those negative stereotypes. Intersectionality was work put out by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she did a lot of great work looking at the fact that if you were to research a particular sect of a group, let's say you look at a group by race, or you look at a group by male or female sex, or if you look at a group by socioeconomic status, and you only look at that one factor, you're missing the complete factor intersectionality of everything else that person's going through. So she did a lot of work to say that, let's take a black woman at work in a predominantly white institution. And if you just look at the fact that she is a woman, you might miss the discrimination she experiences because she's black. You might, and vice versa. So really, it is an understanding of how multiple things can be happening at the same time. Multiple categories of discrimination can be happening at the same time, and that makes it complex as to how to address the issues that you're facing, particularly marginalized groups. Racialized aggression could be overt or subtle, so it could be like in your face, or it could be kind of quiet behind closed doors. But it could be, there's micro and macro aggressions. Macro aggressions are the overt racial aggressions. Microaggressions are subtle. A lot of times they go unnoticed. They could be unconscious. There could be slights. And science has shown, and statistics have shown, and studies have shown that these microaggressions really have enough impact on someone's mental health, on their sense of self, on whether or not they question their reality and whatnot, and whether they believe that they are less than because of what has been said to them or what has been done. So it kind of leads to imposter syndrome, which we'll talk in a moment. So a microaggression might be like, when my professor in my undergrad accused me of cheating because he just didn't think I could write that well. He didn't think a little black girl could write that well. And I showed him my notebook. Back then I wrote out all my essays by hand in my notebook. I wrote out draft after draft after draft. So I showed him the entire notebook and he didn't say anything. He just was like, go sit down. So the undertone or the subtlety there is like, why this is way before ChatGPT. This is way before anything else, right? So like, why did he think that I was cheating? Why did he think like it just wasn't possible for this really good essay to be written by me, right? He had an undertone of racism, right? And he was a professor from Uganda, and he was black. So it wasn't like this was somebody who was, maybe white in the US who had absorbed these stereotypes and beliefs. This was someone who you wouldn't have expected it from, right? And so it cut a little deeper. So microaggressions are subtle, sometimes unconscious, sometimes just right underneath the skin, and they make you wonder, make you question, make you do the mental work of saying, well, wait a minute, why are you saying that? Why are you saying I speak really good? For who? Who do I speak really good for, right? A black person, is that what you're saying, right? So it's mentally causing stress to be experiencing microaggressions. All right, let's see. Here we have stereotype threat. Stereotype threat means you fear confirming negative stereotypes about your racial group. So let's see. A negative stereotype about black people somehow is that we're lazy, even though we survived slavery. So maybe at work you do extra work so nobody can call you the lazy black person, right? It's just defending these negative or counteracting these negative stereotypes so that nobody can say something bad about you, right? And it's mentally draining and straining. Unconscious bias is a belief that you might not know you have, and it is a bias. So as human beings, we are all biased. We all have unconscious biases, and it's just up to us to recognize those and what they are when we can, and to fight against it. But these are implicit, hidden, underlying attitudes and beliefs that we've absorbed from society or we've been programmed to believe by our friends, family, and experiences, etc. Imposter syndrome, I've already mentioned, is doubting one's achievements and fearing exposure as a fraud. So this could be a black person at work who says, oh, I don't really know if I was hired because I have 6 degrees and 10 years of experience. Maybe I was only hired as the diversity hire because they needed to hire a black person to not be racist at this job, right? So you're feeling like you're an imposter, and you're afraid that someone one day from HR is going to be like, you were a diversity hire. So that's just one example of imposter syndrome. Cultural mistrust theory is the consequence of years of negative experiences that the African American people have had in this country with the dominant culture. And so it's an expression of distrust of the institution, of the social discrimination and the historical accounts that have happened in this country. So it goes to show that African Americans tend to have a little mistrust in general society, people outside the black community. And it does too affect their mental state, their psychological state, the physiological state. And it's these things affect us because then we are hesitant to trust in the healthcare system. We're hesitant to really trust even the educational system or the criminal justice system. We just have a cultural mistrust about how things could go in when we experience things in the U.S. because of history, right? All right. Next up, extreme environmental stress. This is constant stress from racism and societal discrimination that affects psychologically, and emotional health. So, unfortunately, we'll talk more about this later on in the class, Black Americans have a higher rate of cardiovascular health than any other people in the U.S. And it means that race is stressing us out. It's stressing our hearts out. And we tend to succumb to more heart conditions than the average person in the U.S. Intergenerational cultural trauma means trauma passed down from one generation to another. And if you are aware, they say that the mothers carry their babies' eggs for 2 generations, right? And so basically, when the mother becomes pregnant, the baby is in the womb, right? And that baby, if it's a girl, before she's born, she will have in her all the eggs that she will ever have. It's not like you keep creating eggs as a female. You are born with a certain number amount of eggs, and that's it. So part of this is likening to the fact that the stress you feel, everything that the mother feels, the baby feels. Everything that we encounter changes our cellular structure, and they medically speaking, like the stress you are in stresses your body out, changes your structure of your cells, makes you more susceptible to disease and whatnot. And everything the mother experiences, the baby experiences too. And also, if the baby is experiencing it, the baby's cells are being changed. The baby's eggs are being changed to be more susceptible to stress-based diseases, etc. So the theory is that, especially for Black women, we carry the stress of our Black mothers, and it's passed down and down and down. So one thing about that is that there was some study done on some mice, and the mice were, unfortunately, they were traumatized, physically traumatized, I think with shocks. And the mice produced more stress-induced babies. But in about 4 or 5 generations down, the scientists did not see any more stress-induced babies, any more baby mice that were susceptible to stress. So what that goes to show us is that although we can carry stress from one generation to another, and the trauma from one generation to another, it is reversible if you do the healing work to heal yourself, right? So that's a good thing. But yes, intergenerational trauma is a thing, and it changes, it has psychological and physiological changes on the body. And from slavery to Jim Crow laws to modern day re-traumatization, it goes to show that if you're not aware that you need to do healing, you could be just continuing this trauma from one generation to the next. Post-traumatic slave syndrome refers to Dr. Joy DeGrew's research on multi-generational trauma leading to behavioral and emotional characteristics like trouble with self-esteem, internalized racism, and maybe expressions of anger, expressions of identity confusion. And it continues the intergenerational cultural trauma theory. And she wrote a book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she tried to really connect the dots and did a great job of doing that, where she linked some of these maladaptive behaviors we see in the Black community to like learned helplessness, for one. Learned helplessness is when you don't believe you can do anything to change your situation, and you believe that you're stuck in your situation. And so we do see a lot of that in the Black community at times. And she linked it back to generations of trauma, multiple systemic, institutional difficulties that Black people face, and not being able to come out of challenging situations and being stuck in those challenging situations. And so she created this theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome to explain why we see so much learned helplessness in the Black community. So we're going to take a look at one example of the criminal justice system and the intersectionality of various types of racism. So let's review these types of racism first, and then we will look at it as applied to the criminal justice system. Individual racism. This is going to be based on your individual prejudices, those prejudgments, individual stereotypes that you believe, and individual conscious or unconscious biases. This is your everyday racism, throwing around racial words, etc., believing in the racial expressions of superiority and dominance over other groups of folks, and holding those racist beliefs. Institutional racism is where an institution or an organization or a company will contribute to the discrimination of a group of people. So the institutional racism is upheld by individuals. It's usually an individual who is the boss, or an individual who establishes or creates or maintains the systems by an institution. So that is how individual racism seeps into an institution, right? And then the institutional culture just perpetuates and perpetuates and perpetuates. And so you'll see that example in the criminal justice system, as we are about to look at. Cultural racism is when you are feeling that your language, your dialect, your values, your beliefs, your religion, your worldview is superior to another person's race. And so that is cultural racism. Symbolic racism is when you is reflected in beliefs among whites that racial discrimination is no longer a problem. So this is kind of the gaslighting racism, because obviously it's still a problem. We do not live in a post-racial society, but you will hear people say that, and that's symbolically racist. Next slide here is internalized racism. So this is when you believe the racial stereotypes, whether positive or negative, about yourself. So if you are of the dominant race in this country, and you are therefore white, and you believe white is superior, then you are suffering from internalized racial superiority. If you are of a technically, according to the U.S., like a subordinate race, which means a person of color, and we're talking about Black people, right? So if you are Black and you believe the negative stereotypes about your race, that you are somehow, less beautiful, you're lazy, or you're born to be a criminal or something like that, those negative stereotypes, then you are suffering from internalized racial inferiority, right? And so we would say you need to check your sense of self and really look at understanding how you could have a positive racial identity development and whatnot. Structural racism is also known as systemic racism. This is the large picture, right? The overall, the history, the culture, multiple institutions, multiple systems, multiple organizations. This is everything coming together, and the fact that one will overlap the other, one will intersect the other, and you will have this negative outcome, which is really out of your control in a structurally racist system. All right, so here's our Venn diagram. And the victim in the middle of our Venn diagram is centered, but we see four other areas that we're going to look at: the police department in general, criminal justice system, which is the lawyers, the judge, etc., the people who work in the police department, and the people who work in the criminal justice system as individuals. So we're going to take a look and see how these things are affected. Now, I will say that a whole nother conversation about where people are policed, we will come to in a moment, or in next unit, to look at how our victim got in the situation to begin with. But in this example, we do not know if the victim is guilty or not. So let's just make that clear. So the types of racism are on the right-hand side, and we're going to place these, and I'm going to explain where we're placing them on the next slide. All right, so we see that in the middle, internalized racial inferiority. Our victim could feel like they're believing the negative stereotypes about themselves. On the right and the left, we see internalized racial superiority. So that is a mix of, hang on, let me get my pointer out here. Turn on the laser pointer. So here, internalized racial superiority. This is going to be a mix of people who work in the police department and the police department in general, right? So the person who works in the police department could have internalized racial superiority. The person who works in the criminal justice system, whether it be the judge, the DA, whoever, has internalized racial superiority. I would also say they could have internalized cultural, like they believe culturally that the way that they speak the way that they see the world, the way that they dress, exhibit themselves is superior to the victim, right? They are believing that they are superior in all these different ways. Down here, we see individual racism and cultural racism as well. And these are the individuals who work in these places. They hold their own individual beliefs, and a lot of times they're not positive, right? I'm not saying everybody is bad who works in the system, but a lot of them do not have unbiased opinions, right? Up here, we see systemic institutional racism. So the system itself, the system of the court system and the system of the police department could have some things intrinsically wrong that are disproportionately affecting people of color. And we will talk about those in just a moment. And then here, this big, oh no. Let me go back to my slideshow. Here, this, is my thingy's gone. Let me get it back. Laser. The structural racism here is this big circle, the big blue one that goes around the whole thing is the structural racism, because that's everything, right? That's everything all in one structurally racist system. So some examples of the systemic problems within the criminal justice system are policing or policy for quotas. So policing, which would be down here, people who work in the police department, they're they're carrying out the order from the police department to make a quota for that day. How many people can you arrest? How many black people can you arrest, right? Quotas are definitely a problem. Biased hiring practices. So here we have biased hiring practices in these two systems that hire people who believe a particular way, because as you know, or as you might not know, the first police department in the United States was created in the South to police, you guessed it, runaway slaves. So the KKK started the police department, basically. And unfortunately, what they did to expand the police department was they took some of those folks and they placed them in other areas of the country to start police departments. So that's the reason why the police department is so biased, because this was designed that way. Neglecting to have proper training. So people say, well, if we just trained the people who worked in the police department and the criminal justice system, maybe they would be less racist. And I'm all for unbiased training, but I don't know if that's going to solve our issues alone, if just training people alone would solve the issues. Then we have policies of the police department. Stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is a racist policy because it targets people in low-income neighborhoods for over-policing, and a reason to stop them. They could just be walking down the street, and stop and frisk became a thing, and they were just stopping and harassing folks. So this victim could have been a stop and frisk victim, yet they are, behind bars for something that they didn't do, etc. The chokehold policy, the one where you get to kill people. So that's a racist policy that negatively affects folks. And if people who are being targeted are in these low-income, multi-ethnic communities, and so they're going to be black and brown folks, then the people who are getting the chokehold and the people who are getting the knee to the neck, they're going to be black and brown folks, right? So at a disproportionate level, as we see in our jail systems, it's disproportionately black and brown folks. So obviously the system is not set up to, really reflect actual policing. It's set up to put us behind bars. And then policing certain neighborhoods more than others. The over-policing of our black and brown neighborhoods is not statistically equal to like the amount of folks who end up in the prison system or in the jail system. When you look at the population of the U.S. and the population of our system, of our locked up system, it's stark, right? Let's say, I don't know what the numbers are, the population in the U.S., but I have seen the numbers in the black and brown folks in the institutions, and it is ridiculous. So obviously, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out something's not right. So it's interesting because, you could be walking down the street, you could be stopped and frisked, you could be locked up, they could then say, oh, you look like somebody who committed a crime, and then they then say, well, if you don't want to go down for that crime, we'll give you a public defender, and the public defender works for the criminal justice system. They do not work for the victim. They get the victim to take a plea deal, right? And then the plea deal is a lesser crime, but it's still a crime nonetheless that the person didn't commit, may or may not have committed. And now this person who may or may not have committed a crime has a record, which then makes it harder for them to get a job when they come out, which then makes it harder to provide for themselves or their family. So it's just exponentially difficult, and the system, as they say, is created that way. So that is the extent of our presentation. And I do hope that you are, I have one more slide. This is what I was just saying, my bad. So here we see the public defender. As I just mentioned, the public defender works for the court. They are going to try to get you to take a plea deal, right? Pushing the innocent to take a plea deal means there are more innocent people behind bars with records. And then there's the policies on making bail. They have higher bail amounts for people of color as opposed to their white counterparts who committed the same crime or who were accused of committing the same crime. And then the disproportionate sentencing timeframes means that a black and white person do the same crime. The black person gets more time than the white person. That was seen with the war on drugs. The war on drugs allowed for so many more people of color to be incarcerated because they were, I think it was crack cocaine, right? It was crack cocaine. And what they were saying was that it was a lesser sentence for crack cocaine than powder cocaine, because powder cocaine was more expensive and you saw that more in the white communities, and crack cocaine you saw in the black and brown communities. And so for crack cocaine, the time sentence was 3 to 4 times longer than for powder cocaine. So obviously we have a classist sentencing there based on that crime. And the 3 strikes law sounded great at first, but the 3 strikes law really was a detriment to putting people away. I'm sure there are examples where it actually helped put certain folks away who needed to be put behind bars, but for the most part, it just increased the numbers exponentially of black and brown people who got to be put away because they could possibly have 2 previous strikes from being a victim because their neighborhood was policed more, or they got stopped and frisked, or they had to plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit, right, because they couldn't afford a lawyer. So the 3 strikes law was really one of those institutionally racist policies to lock up more black and brown folks. And we see that it was basically that's what it was. So hopefully you see how all of these things we're talking about intersect, makes things more difficult for black folks in the criminal justice system. And hopefully you see how these contemporary black psychological concepts can be seen even in that example when you're looking at mundane environmental stress, the stress of being policed in your neighborhood, when you're looking at imposter syndrome, when you're looking at stereotype threat, hopefully you can see how these things are interacting and affecting black folks in the United States.